Kia ora and welcome to our session today. We are incredibly fortunate that our special guest today is Aliya Denzeisen, and me and Aliya were connected through the FINS conference last year. Aliya was awarded the Fundraiser Newcomer of the Year at the FINS conference last year, and we are delighted to have you join us today. Welcome, Aliya.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. It's
Yes,
really good to connect again.
yeah, we were just chatting before we hit record. I think Aliya is going to be an amazing guest for us, and we're going to ask some really interesting questions about lots of things. So I'm going to start off with Aliya. Tell us about who you are, where you work, and what it is you do in the sector.
Sure. So I'm Aliya Denzeisen, and I'm the national coordinator for the Islamic Women's Council of New Zealand, which is the national voice for Muslim women in the country. And what I do on a day-to-day basis changes, but the core business that we do are two things. One, developing and empowering Muslim women so they can stand strong and steadfast in New Zealand. But the other one is a lot of advocacy with the government and with other um, organizations so that they can understand how best to interact with our community, but also to support us where we need support. And so
Wonderful.
those are the
And
core
so
stuff.
if we just go backwards from where you are now, where did your journey start in this advocacy space?
So you have to go back for 30 years ago, really, technically, because I became a lawyer in the US. Um, and I was a litigator in the United States. And I actually migrated to New Zealand to rest. I left my law. I was working on big legal cases in the United States, litigating, but as a family, we decided where would it be best to live, and ultimately, I decided to move to New Zealand and to come here and go back to what I did before I practiced law, which was teaching,
Yeah,
and to come and rest in New Zealand. But I haven't been successful in the rest, but I've been enjoying myself still.
wonderful. So I think one of the I think I give all of our speakers sets of questions, and I think there'll be a couple in there that I'm going to ask, but I think I'm going to go back to a subject I think many people would like to understand a bit of an insight, and was the devastating Christchurch mosque attack. So that, like you just told me, this threw your entire community into the limelight. It was not something anyone expected. What what was that immediate aftermath like for you? And then we'll maybe discuss kind of where we're at now. But if we start with the kind of the yeah when it happened and how your community kind of responded.
Yeah. If I'll jump even like 2 or 3 years before, just so that
Brilliant.
you can understand how IWCNZ ended up central. Because of what was going on globally, like with ISIS and things overseas, um, we started advocating inside of New Zealand because we were seeing a rise in hate
Hmm.
inside of New Zealand. So we as a council were starting to advocate in that space for trying to get support around our community. And so we started interacting with the government a bit more. So when the attacks happened, we already had some relationships built with the New Zealand government, but also we had to work on getting the support that needed immediately, on the ground. So the day of the call, or the day of the attacks, we were talking with government ministers about what needed to do happen, what was going on, also getting updates about what the incident occurred. But then it was ensuring that the support for the families and the impacted was actually sufficient, because it was such a massive amount of incidents. It was a big attack on a small nation, on a very
Yeah.
small community in New Zealand. And so we ended up, ourselves and another national organization that is more male,
Yeah.
ended up being that national wraparound and advocacy for
Mhm.
like getting family into support and getting the community needs that
Mhm.
were immediate met. Like, for example, people, because when we go into to pray, we often leave cell phones and our IDs in the car because we're just focused on our prayer. So a lot of people didn't even have their IDs or their phones with them, and even financially to, so their cards were in, and that was within a crime scene, so you couldn't
Yeah.
get access to them. So little support, even getting funds to the families or getting identification or communicating with the police, where on the men's side they were dealing more with the coroner directly. So
Yeah.
there, that was the immediate, but then it continued on working with victim support.
Yeah.
We then it goes into what the initially what was going to be a trial, but he pled guilty, and then the sentencing, so what that looks like. And people think like it's over now, but actually we're heading in now to a coronial inquest, which is set for the end of the year. So we're still 4 years on, still dealing with direct impacts. But the other part of it is there's a blowout, consequentially for us, because of the big impact of on the immediate community, and there's long-term consequences individually on the families,
Yeah.
and then wider from realizing how big the problem may be related to hate in New Zealand. And
Absolutely.
so we've been, the topics I cover in a day, Michelle, would
They're
be,
huge.
I deal with
Um,
counterterrorism, I deal with
yes.
racism, I deal with educational resources, I'll deal with health and sports and activities and swimming. And in a day, what comes across my, I can't always predict
It's
what's gonna, my day's
it's
gonna be.
incredible. Just going backwards there, give us a bit of an insight into, so you are the Women's Institute, with the Women's Institute.
Council.
Um, so was there, um, explain to me why and it's because you briefly touched on the men's role, and so I'm still learning about this too. So in your cultural world, there was obviously a need for women to be represented prior to the Christchurch Mosque, and how does was the was the advocacy during that time more challenging, or was that, and was people able to come together, the men and the women, to get what was needed done for everyone?
Yeah, so to understand the dynamics in the Muslim community, it's a whole culture. But
Yeah.
if you think of My Big Fat Greek Wedding, I don't know if you remember about, when the young woman said to her mother, oh, he's the head of the family, and the mother's like, yes, but I'm the neck, right? And I move the head, and and so symbiotically in the Muslim community, often people are saying the men are in the front, but actually, if you want to get things done, you actually work with the women, like
Yeah.
we are the doers, and so there's a lot of things going on, and there are a lot of cultures that work like that, but in the Muslim community the actual substantive things are directed by women, but not necessarily always in the front.
Yeah.
And at the time of the attacks, I was not the national coordinator of that, but I was on the ground, helping direct, some of the delivery of the resources that needed to go to the families and things. And you just do that and get
Yeah.
alongside it, because it's and communication wasn't an issue because we had the network already built. And I think globally, people talk about the response of the New Zealand government in
Yeah.
that, but there was a response from the Muslim community, and that was because we had the networks built and also had relationships built,
Yeah.
and were able to express the needs. For example, women led a lot of the media because we had
Yes.
been media trained before. We had trained our own women, on media prior, and so we we handled, while the men were dealing with the coroner, we were handling, international and national media
Yeah.
on
So you're,
getting messages out
yeah.
both to the community, but nation and internationally as well. So there's a dynamic that once you know how the Muslim community works and you have the connections, then you can get a lot done. But
Yeah.
if you don't know, um, who the doers are, or don't have access to the women for one, and it usually comes more through women. Women are far more comfortable with that relationship to have those conversations. More gets done
Absolutely.
faster, I guess. Men would probably disagree, but I would,
Yeah.
they wouldn't say it in front of me.
Yeah. And so what if we look now, let's say we've gone forward 4 years, and as you mentioned, it's still ongoing. This is not ended. What kind of what positive outcomes, and I'm going to ask the flip side of this, but what have been I guess the greatest achievements out of what happened for the Muslim community in New Zealand?
Yeah, so I guess a legacy of the attacks is that things are done differently in New Zealand than the rest of the world. And
Yeah,
it's a positive legacy that it has people looking at New Zealand as a nation going, why are things different? Why is the Muslim community more settled in New Zealand? Why are they positive, and how are you building that relationship? And that's a positive. Another positive is the strength of Muslim women in the sense of our the nation now, because we've had to advocate, and because it was the Islamic Women's Council that was advocating to the government, we ended up at the forefront of the Royal Commission.
yeah,
And because we were in media, we have been quite visual, or in front of people. And so there's been a change related to perceptions of Muslim women in
yeah,
New Zealand, as perhaps prior to, we call it gendered Islamophobia. So
yeah.
not only do you have Islamophobia, Muslims are this way, but Muslim women can't do anything. They can't speak for themselves. They're not. That has kind of flown out of the window in New Zealand. Everybody knows that there are strong Muslim women in New
Wonderful.
Zealand, and that's really, really a positive outcome that's
Yeah.
come out
And
of that,
do you feel
unfortunately.
that the way Jacinda responded and how she behaved and how she chose to dress during that, do you think that she was a huge advocate and kind of shining the light on those things?
Yeah, well, it was like, for example, there are countries still today where people can't wear a headscarf
Hmm.
in public, or they can't work in that sphere. And you have a head of government who, on her own, we didn't ask her to wear
Yeah.
a headscarf. She just, in solidarity with us at that time, donned a headscarf, and it motivated the nation. Like, I don't know if you remember, but there was actually the Friday afterwards, there was a wear a hijab. Again,
Yeah.
it was in solidarity. And it initially, we had been approached and we didn't really know how we were feeling about it.
Yeah.
Like, half of the people thought no, they shouldn't, the other half were
Hmm.
like, no, it's good. It's But when we were driving to the burial that day, you could see the streets were just lined with people getting on buses in scarves, and you started realizing how many people. I'm getting emotional even.
Yeah.
How many people were in support? We had seen the flower wall, but when you're driving down the street and you're seeing all these people with
Yeah.
a scarf,
Definitely.
it was very powerful.
It's a real, I guess, and I'm glad you even said, people in your community were like, is this, do we like this or don't we? But actually, it must have displayed the strongest visual, um, I guess, support. There's not a
Yeah,
bigger kind of visual standing by you than doing that. And I think if that's beautiful that people could do that.
yeah, it was on the street, like, so driving to Hagley Park, where the prayer was being held. It was a public prayer, but just to see, and you can tell. I mean, you can tell when a woman naturally wears a head, or
Yeah,
wears one daily and doesn't. You can, Muslim women go,
yeah,
oh, she hasn't worn this before, or things.
yeah,
But it was just continual. Like, every bus stops had young people, wearing, older people. The age range was, it was yeah, it was that sign of support. And that's the one of the things that Jacinda had, was she opened there's nothing wrong to stand in solidarity with somebody who's
Yes.
different than you.
Yeah.
And that has opened up a lot of other discussions, not just in New Zealand, but globally.
Yeah.
And even she's allowed us, I guess, I mean, we always had it, but she allowed New Zealand to recapture the Arabic language for our community.
Yeah.
Just saying assalamu alaikum or
Yeah.
a few words, or referring to those killed as shaheed.
Yeah.
Um, and because our language has been used against us
Yeah.
offensively, where she at least brokered the nation to be open to allow us to be who we are,
Beautiful.
you know.
And we'll circle back on this, but great kind of segue into, I did a bit of a deep dive on your LinkedIn,
Mm,
and we will throw it up with your video, but there's the most beautiful photo of you with Jacinda, because you had the honour of being invited to her valedictory speech in New Zealand
yeah.
Parliament. So give us a couple. Yeah, I mean, we've all listened to it, but being there, what was your biggest takeaway from that?
Um, for us as a community, for me personally, when I got the invitation, it actually caused me to cry, which
Yeah,
I'm not usually a huge crier, but I did not more. I was very sad that she was going. I
yeah,
knew, you know what I mean? That was one, but it was also that we had navigated what were really challenging conversations, and
mhm,
she still wanted me and my colleagues, there were three of us that were invited to be present. It
great.
was that we navigated it with integrity. So that part of it was just personally very important. But what was said, um, acknowledging the legacy, there were a couple language in there about also trying to motivate the current government, because it
Yeah,
changes when you get new leadership, you get a new dynamic to continue to stand alongside us, which was a concern, but it looks
yeah,
like they are as well. And the big personal thing for IWCNs that are more to our portfolio was we've been working on women's leadership. And
yeah,
actually, she worked alongside us to provide a leadership forum last year that we did a joint one, bringing 100 Muslim women together. And so that last segment about you can be nervous, you can be, I forget the exact words, but her last segment, you can lead like me.
yeah,
You can be an anxious leader. You can have
yeah.
children. You can, and that part of it, from the Islamic Women's Council's perspective, that was probably the most
Powerful.
powerful thing, is that there is not one set defined look or experience that can make a good leader for this nation.
Yeah,
And
wonderful.
so that was lovely. And then, there was a banquet afterwards. And so we were able to catch up there as well.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah,
you
I mean,
know,
she definitely left an impression on me. I think for most of us, Wahine Toa in New Zealand, she was incredible,
yeah,
and thankfully she's now getting to do what she needs to do. So just
yeah.
circling back on the learnings from the mosque, it can't all be sunshine and butterflies. What still needs to be done? What still needs to be
So
advocated for?
there's a
Yeah,
lot. And that's so we've been in the space. The Islamic Women's Council has been a suspect community prior to the attacks. We were directly impacted by these attacks, and since then we're also a targeted community since, or still since, um, and but we're connected with other communities now that also experience terrorism, like for example in Norway, um, in the U.S., India. And there are long-term consequences from attacks like this. So if you take Norway, which was 11, 12 years ago now, we know where they're at, and the recovery, ours are tracking alongside that. But the mental health and the economic support that was placed around the impacted in Norway, no way to the New Zealand has not even reached probably a tenth of the support that was
Yeah.
provided around that attack, and we're worried that long-term consequences will be bigger as a result, because we're a small community, but it was one direct community, where in Norway, those impacted were able to go back to their own communities,
Yeah.
and didn't live amongst it daily. So there are big consequences there. And then the other part of it that people don't realize from our community is that we demographically are different. So because of immigration, we don't have elders. Like
Yeah.
well, some people might say I'm old anyway, but in I'm in my early 50s, and
Yeah.
I'm considered an elder in the Muslim community because immigration didn't allow us to bring our parents with us when
Right.
we immigrated. And as a result, we only have 5% that are over age 65 of our community,
Wow.
versus New Zealand has the average community is 20%,
Yeah.
and we have a lot younger.
Yeah.
So where the average New Zealand population has a youth of 40%, we have 65%.
Wow.
So when I say I'm over capacity, I'm like this chicken that has like 17 chicks versus everyone else having 5, you know?
Yeah.
And so that overcapacity thing has required us to do a lot of fundraising, to step into that space to try and get the support that we need, because we have to hire people to help
Yeah.
us, because we don't naturally have it in the community because of those policies that prevented us from bringing our elders. And so therefore, we're seeking funds from government to help us employ social workers and youth workers. We're out there, and that's how I became
Yeah.
the
Raising.
the
Yeah.
the fundraiser newcomer of the year, was
Yeah.
because we had so many needs that weren't being met, and they weren't being met by government funding by any means. In part because they rely a lot on lotteries, and we can't take
Yeah.
lotteries. So I had to go out with my team of 5. We applied for the funding net. I don't know if you remember
Yeah.
the generosity
In the
generator that's
generosity
going on. Yeah.
generator. Yeah.
We applied and we took that course, which was six hours of intensive training on how to crowdfund. And then we came up with our crowdfunding campaign, begging and borrowing and stealing from our friends for advice, videoing, things like that, to come up with a campaign
Amazing.
so that we could get the support to get youth to camps and things like that, to get the wraparound they need.
And talking about fundraising, is the Islamic community a generous community when it comes to, that filling that need? Is it?
Well, we were really, with our first funding campaign, they were extraordinarily generous. Like we for a small community, we raised 50,000 in less than a month, just doing a crowdfunding campaign. But the issue that happens is a lot of because there are so many demands in the community. It's not easy to rock up to a mosque or a Muslim women's group, to rock up and go, can you help us here? Because there are so many community needs, as
Yeah.
well as in the sense of they may be providing social welfare to help people. For example, people who migrate, a lot of them, for 2 years, you won't you don't get any support if you lose your job or things like that.
Yeah.
So during COVID, we were delivering food parcels all over the place, because they just couldn't access the same um, support that other people in the community were getting. And as a result, that kind of depleted that welfare accounts that we've had.
Yeah.
But we're rebuilding them again.
Yeah.
And
And the response from the New Zealand public, I know there's been some controversy around it, but regardless of what was done, the amount raised in the aftermath from everyday Kiwis was phenomenal. And that's when we
yeah,
talk about, in times of crisis, people need to give, and they give to need. And they responded beautifully. It was overwhelming how much the New
yeah,
Zealand public, and I guess now you have to understand how you capture, the, that crisis, that appalling thing that happened, maybe gone for most of the New Zealand public, but the need of your community is still as great. And how do you capture everyday Kiwis to still support your community? I'm sure that's something
Yeah.
that you want to understand.
If I can give you an example, what we feel the first, so when the attacks happened, it would be like when you cut yourself and you're triaging. You triage to stop the bleeding,
Yeah,
and then at some point you have to lift and see what the damage is and try and the triage really was the first 3 years
yeah,
just in Christchurch.
yeah,
But there actually has been an impact nationally. So for Muslim children, like we can no longer say to our children, oh, don't worry, um, you're not going to be targeted. Don't worry that you know what I mean? You're safe here. As a nation, we know we're not safe, but for our children that are identifiable, it's a bigger issue, not just in Christchurch, but nationwide. And we do see anxiety coming out that's probably a bit higher than, not
yeah,
even, we know it's higher than the average right now. Um, and that part of it is an example that the average New Zealander wouldn't understand.
yeah,
But inside of the Muslim community, we understand it because also we were such a small community that everybody knew at least one person. Some of us knew like half of the people who were who lost their lives, let alone the bullet wounded and the people who were present. And so it has a consequence on our families as well.
yeah,
Like our own children holidayed in January with someone who died,
yeah,
right? And one of our child saw the video and saw him killed. Um, and we've had to process. We don't live in Christchurch
yeah,
directly, right? And so that's an example. But even children who didn't know someone, but they know the realities and that they might be identifiable by how
yeah,
they dress or that they are, of African or Middle Eastern, that they will be targeted one way or the other. It's caused concern that we
absolutely.
can't, where before you would say you're safe in New Zealand,
Yeah.
you can't have that same conversation. So that has different consequences as well.
Absolutely, and even those, you mentioned the youth stats are so high, and even for small children, being a teenager, I've had five of my own. Even just being a teenager is so difficult. But then, 10 years later, they're going to process this in a whole different way when they're teenagers, and that's going to potentially have a bigger impact, isn't it, on their mental health then? So it's this is a lifetime of support to make sure that these
Exactly.
people feel safe and well.
And that's what the
Absolutely.
terrorism experts are saying that have dealt with the psychological consequences.
Yeah,
Somebody talked about it that there isn't actually a horizon. You walk towards the horizon, you think, to get better and things, but there's never actually an end. There's always going to be, and just you have to accept that.
yeah,
And it's how we navigate it. And we want to navigate it in the best way to prevent intergenerational
yeah,
trauma as well, as much as
absolutely.
possible.
So I noticed on when I was going through your LinkedIn around the Education Review Office, around education for all your children, embracing diverse ethnicities report. So it identifies some key learnings for children and young people from ethnic communities. Would you like to give us just a brief on that report and what it hopes to achieve?
Yep. So the report, the Education Review Office does research into where they think schools should be looking, and then they give advice. And one of them that came up through the Royal Commission was how many children were being harassed inside of schools, and not just bullied by peers, but also harassed inside the classroom by teachers even. And so the Education Review Office took upon found a way to do the research, and they did the research, and this is the report came out based on the what they found, and they did find a consistent number of young people being bullied in school. They also found a consistent number of seeing it on other children. If they themselves hadn't, they saw other children. And they also saw teachers that needed to either get around it or maybe even potentially get out of the classroom. Um, and the report seeks to achieve to help leaders inside of schools, teachers also to be aware, to understand maybe some of the language, but also to give them support on how they can get around it and
Yeah.
how they can improve. And also, this one, they didn't expect it to be so high, but to raise a flag that there is an outright concern that children are experiencing racism consistently in the schools,
Yeah.
and that this is supposed to be a safe place for all. And so, how to do that. The other thing that was said about the consequence, but now it's open, was that African and Middle Eastern children are 4 out of 10 are considering suicide at the moment,
Wow.
which is a huge, huge number and a very concerning thing. But we have the first government document. We have been advocating saying this is, and these are the consequences, and all the research says these are the consequences if we don't get in front of it. We now have a document from the New Zealand government that confirms it's happening, confirms that this is where we're at. And so even though it's a sad statistic, it's now openly in the public, and we are having the conversations that need to be had about addressing it.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's the first step to making progress on some challenging issues. But it again requires, like, we would like as a council to get resources ourselves to guidance counselors to help
Yeah.
them so that they can step into the space with the children, because we're so over capacity. So we want to create resources that will help them to step into that space where we can't be
Yeah.
because of the low numbers. But that requires funds, and that requires time, and that requires people to work around us. And so it just becomes a cyclical, it seems like, raise funds, do the job, raise funds, do the job.
Yeah.
And that's, and advocate on why you need to do the job. But but there's good things in it,
Yeah.
Michelle. There are really,
Yeah.
we're inspiring people. I don't know if you saw the educational resources that we created
Yeah.
that are available both for secondary and for primary schools. And there are resources for teachers that go alongside and support. So it makes it easier for them to implement the ideas. And they're quite
Yeah.
exciting, in my
It's
opinion.
incredible. You are an incredible Wahine Toa, and I could talk to you for hours. But what I do want to know is who is Aliya outside of what you do? Who are you? What fills your cup?
Yeah, so for me, I'm very social.
Mhm.
Um I like um I like celebrating events. I'm a big uh I like a good party.
Yeah.
And I like, I like to travel.
Yeah.
So one of the things, New Zealand being so far away, it slowed my travel quite a bit. So I like to travel. I used to like to read. I just haven't. I'm now. I listen to podcasts because, for the same reasoning. I just don't have time to sit down and read like I
Yeah.
used to. And the big part though is the social, and I like a good joke. But
Both
people look at me, do you know what I mean? Like, people think they got a nun. I don't know, like, I always had that stereotype of nuns until I went to an all girls Catholic school in
yeah.
South America. And then I'm like, man, these guys are so much fun,
Yeah.
and that was in high school for myself. But so I like a good joke. I like
Yeah.
having just good
Laughter is
conversation.
important, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
incredibly
that's
is.
a
And
bit
I'm
of
glad
who I
to hear you
am.
love to travel because we will be delivering education around Australia and New Zealand. And we would love to help bring you out to talk to groups about what you do,
Oh,
both
cool.
in Australia and in New Zealand. I think you've got some powerful messages to share. You are a fundraiser who is his, is against all odds, able to tell the stories and do how you fit it into everything else you do is phenomenal, and you absolutely deserved that award last year. So
Thank you.
just as we wrap up, what advice would you give to your younger self? What do you wish you knew then that you don't that you know that you know now?
You're far more powerful than you think you are. You know, I I think I've heard it from other people too, but I think by the time I was 40, I was like, well, yeah, you've got abilities here and use them. Do you know what I mean? Where everybody was telling me when I was 25, you're really good at this, and you look at it and you go, yeah, it was heavy, but I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And if I could go back in time, it's not regret, but boy, there were opportunities that I could have taken further and faster and gotten, but I wouldn't be where I'm at
Yeah.
now. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't be probably as empathetic as I am.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying I'm super empathetic, but I have empathy for people who aren't able to
Yes.
overcome those things, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Imposter syndrome never, well, it never leaves me, that's for sure. But I'm mid 40s now, and I am starting to, say to myself more, well, yeah, actually, you do have some value, but it's a hard thing, isn't it? And it's funny, we've
Yeah.
had a few guests on this week, and that the general theme around that question is being more confident, believing in myself, being braver and bolder, all of those things that we know. And so, yeah, I think by
Yeah.
sharing that that's what we wish we knew is how young people will take on board that
And it's
knowledge.
okay to ask.
Yes.
It's okay to ask. Like this one, I used to sit and wait for someone to notice. Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? But sometimes we've got to ask, and then they'll
Yeah.
be like, "Yeah, come on into this space." And I didn't have that confidence that I do now,
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. Isha's sitting here with me, and one of the things she's really good at reminding me is that, you know, not only asking, but telling people what it is you need, because we all think that
Yeah.
people just know. And so we don't like to be direct and say, well, actually, yes, I do need help. Or if they offer to help, but also attached to asking is telling people what you need.
Yeah.
And that can often be, for me, quite hard, that I feel quite, oh, I don't want to ask that. But if
Yeah.
somebody's asking to help, tell them what you need and tell them exactly how they can help you.
Yeah. And sometimes you feel like you're making yourself vulnerable, but actually it becomes a strength to be able to articulate it and
Yes, yeah, and then
yeah.
you're not left guessing why they didn't quite do what you wanted them to, and what was the, you start overthinking all of these things when actually they didn't know what you needed. So,
Ex-
yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah, absolutely. Listen, we've come to the end of our time today. I am incredibly, you're a huge inspiration to me, and I really thank
Same.
you for having this conversation and talking about a time in New Zealand that was difficult for us all, and hearing some of your perspective. I doubt this will be the last time we hear from you. And thank you so much. And yeah, keep going with your fundraising efforts. I think it's wonderful. And hopefully there's lots of people in the community have if you want advice. That's what it's for. It's to say, hey, does
Yeah.
anyone know about this or this? And it's a community that's going to, build over time. But it's about people inspire people helping each other. That peer-to-peer support is incredibly invaluable, and that's what's been important in my life, and that's why the community hub is this
Yeah.
space for it's dedicated to our sector, so you can feel safe and comfortable asking those questions that you might not ask on other social media, because people get it. There is no wrong answer, and the commonality thing is something that I'm passionate about. You join the commonalities, in that space,
Yeah.
everyone in there shares that commonality. And I think commonality is so important in life. It just takes one commonality for a relationship to grow.
Yeah. And it's you end up finding more along the way. Always. It's very rare that you don't. And I just really value that you reached out for this conversation and to share that the hub exists, because it really is the next step that we need to go into,
Yeah,
and really appreciate
absolutely.
it and
And
excited
we,
that you're
yeah,
doing it.
and we will be in touch because we're coming over. We're running an event in August,
Oh, cool.
and you are on our list to approach if you feel like a trip round. Auckland, Wellington, and Christchurch is potentially where we're going. So we will be in touch to talk about that, and maybe get you over to Australia sometime as well. That would be wonderful.
Awesome. That would be
Brilliant.
beautiful.
Aliya, thank you so much, and we will talk again soon. Ka
Okay.
kite.
Kia ora. Take care.